Nick Hale had built his entire life on control. He was a man who anticipated every outcome, who never let emotions interfere with logic. But all it took was one evening, one quiet dinner in an unremarkable restaurant, for his world to shatter. The moment he heard a child's quiet sobs, he hadn't expected to care. The moment he saw her wide blue eyes, his blue eyes, he hadn't expected to feel. And when her mother turned around, pale and frozen, whispering his name like a ghost from the past, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. Because the little girl wasn't just a lost child. She was his daughter. And he had never even known she existed. Nick Hale was used to control. In business, in negotiations, in life, everything followed a plan. There were no surprises, no missed opportunities, no loose ends. That was how he built his company, how he maintained his success. But tonight, for the first time in years, he had stepped away from the structured world of corporate meetings and investor dinners and chosen something different. He wanted a quiet meal, somewhere away from the usual luxury, somewhere he could be anonymous. He found himself in a small, family-owned restaurant on the outskirts of the city. It was warm and welcoming, with the scent of freshly baked bread and grilled steak filling the air. The kind of place where people weren't in a rush, where laughter filled the booths instead of hushed business conversations. The waitresses bustled between tables, greeting regulars by name, and there was a hum of familiarity in the air. Nick chose a table by the window, ordering a steak and a glass of wine. He allowed himself a rare moment to simply sit and breathe, to look around without the weight of deadlines pressing down on him. It was strange, how unfamiliar relaxation felt. He was about to take his first sip of wine when a sound cut through the gentle murmur of the restaurant, a soft, trembling sob. He glanced up, scanning the room until his gaze landed on a small figure near the counter. A little girl sat on the floor, her tiny shoulders shaking as she wiped at her face with small fists. She couldn't have been older than 4. Dark curls framed her round face, and even from a distance, Nick could see the bright blue of her eyes, filled with tears. Something in his chest tightened. He wasn't the kind of man who got involved in personal matters, let alone the problems of strangers. But something about this little girl, sitting alone on the floor of a busy restaurant, looking lost and scared, made it impossible to look away. He pushed back his chair and stood, crossing the room in a few strides. He crouched down beside her, making sure not to startle her. "Hey," he said gently. "Are you okay?" The little girl sniffled, looking up at him with tear-streaked cheeks. "I'm lost," she whispered. Nick felt a surprising pang of concern. He had expected to hear something like, "I dropped my toy," or "I spilled my drink." But lost? That was different. He glanced around, scanning the restaurant for a panicked parent, but no one seemed to be searching for a missing child. That only made his concern grow. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice calm. The girl hesitated, then wiped her nose with the sleeve of her tiny sweater. "Lily." Nick nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "That's a beautiful name, Lily. Where's your mom?" Her lips wobbled again, and she shook her head. "She was here, but then she went away. She said she'd be right back. But then I couldn't find her." Nick exhaled slowly, realizing what must have happened. If her mother worked here, she had probably stepped away for just a moment, expecting Lily to stay in one spot. And Lily, being a small child in a busy restaurant, had wandered off instead. He wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to help. He could have called a waitress over, let them handle it, gone back to his table and his untouched steak. But something about Lily's wide, frightened eyes kept him in place. "Your mom works here?" he asked. Lily nodded. "She's a waitress." That confirmed it. Nick looked around again, spotting a few waitresses weaving between tables, their trays balanced on their arms, but none of them seemed to be looking for a child. "All right," he said. "Let's find her together, okay?" Lily hesitated for only a second before slipping her small hand into his much larger one. The warmth of it surprised him. He wasn't used to holding something so small, so delicate. It felt unfamiliar. But as they walked together through the restaurant, searching for Lily's mother, Nick had no idea that this moment, this small, seemingly insignificant decision, would change his life forever. Nick walked slowly through the restaurant, his large hand carefully holding Lily's tiny one as he scanned the busy room. The warmth of her fingers felt strangely fragile against his palm, and he found himself gripping her just a little tighter, as if afraid she might slip away. Lily stayed close to him, her free hand clutching the hem of her small sweater. Her big blue eyes darted around the restaurant, looking for a familiar face, but the more they walked, the more uncertain she seemed. "Do you remember where she was when you last saw her?" Nick asked, keeping his voice gentle. Lily hesitated, then pointed toward the far side of the restaurant, where a counter stood with stacks of menus and a cash register. "She was over there," she said. "But she went to take food to someone, and then I didn't see her anymore." Nick nodded, leading her in that direction. The restaurant was still bustling, but as they moved closer to the counter, something shifted. A voice cut through the noise, frantic, full of worry. "Lily." Lily immediately perked up, turning toward the sound. A woman rushed toward them, weaving through tables with the urgency of someone who had been searching for far too long. She wore a simple black dress, an apron tied around her waist, and her brown hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail. Her dark eyes were wide with panic until they landed on Lily, and relief washed over her features. Lily's face lit up. "Mommy." Before Nick could react, the little girl let go of his hand and ran straight into her mother's arms. The woman scooped her up, holding her tightly against her chest. "Oh my God, baby, where did you go?" Her voice wavered as she smoothed Lily's hair, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I told you to stay near the counter." "I did," Lily mumbled into her shoulder. "But then I didn't see you, and I got scared." The woman exhaled shakily, closing her eyes for a brief second before pulling back to check her daughter's face. "Are you okay? You're not hurt?" Lily shook her head. "I'm okay." Nick, who had taken a step back to give them space, found himself frozen as the woman finally lifted her gaze to look at him. And in an instant, everything shifted. Nick knew those eyes. The color was different, dark brown instead of Lily's bright blue, but the shape, the way they widened in shock, the way they reflected something raw and unspoken, it was all too familiar. He knew her. She knew him. A moment of silence passed between them, stretching long and heavy. "Nick?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, like she didn't quite believe what she was seeing. Nick felt something tighten in his chest. He hadn't heard that voice in years, but he still recognized it. "Rose," he said, his own voice lower than usual. Her grip on Lily tightened slightly, as if on instinct. Nick couldn't move. He couldn't think. Because now that he was looking at her, really looking at her, a realization hit him so hard it nearly knocked the air from his lungs. Lily. Dark hair. Blue eyes. She wasn't just any little girl. She wasn't just a lost child in a restaurant. She looked exactly like him. Nick's stomach dropped. He felt his hands curl into fists as he forced himself to breathe. He turned his gaze back to Rose, his jaw tightening. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. His heart pounded as he asked the question that would change everything. "Is she my daughter?" Rose felt her breath catch in her throat. Her arms instinctively tightened around Lily, as if she could somehow shield her daughter from the weight of the moment. She had imagined this scenario countless times, had thought about what she would say if she ever saw Nick again. But she had never been prepared for the real thing. Nick stood in front of her, his broad shoulders tense, his blue eyes locked onto her with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. He had always had that presence, the kind that demanded answers without having to say much. But now, there was something different in his gaze, something raw, something she couldn't escape. Is she my daughter? His voice was quieter this time, but the demand in his tone remained. Rose's heart pounded in her chest. She had always known this day would come. She just hadn't expected it to happen in the middle of a crowded restaurant, with Lily's small arms wrapped around her neck, oblivious to the storm that was about to break. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Lying wasn't an option. She had already kept the truth from him for years, and she knew there was no way to deny it now, not when Lily was standing right there, looking like a miniature version of him. Rose closed her eyes for a brief second before meeting his gaze again. Yes, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She's yours. The silence that followed was deafening. Nick didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable, as if he were trying to process the weight of what she had just said. Rose braced herself for anger, for accusations, for anything, but the look in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was something deeper, something almost like betrayal. How long? His voice was controlled, but she could hear the tension beneath it. Rose swallowed hard. 4 years. Nick exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair. 4 years, he repeated, as if saying it out loud would make it feel real. He looked back at Lily, who was watching them both with quiet curiosity, completely unaware of the meaning behind their conversation. Why didn't you tell me? His voice was lower now, but there was no mistaking the sharp edge to it. Rose's fingers curled slightly against Lily's back. Because you had your whole life ahead of you, she said, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. You were building an empire. You had investors, meetings, deals worth millions. You were traveling across the world, barely stopping for anything. She broke off, shaking her head. I didn't want to be the person who held you back. Nick let out a quiet, humorless laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. Held me back. His blue eyes burned into hers. You didn't think I had the right to make that choice for myself? Rose's chest tightened. I thought I was doing the right thing. Nick's jaw clenched. The right thing? His voice was lower now, rougher. You decided for me, Rose. You decided that I didn't deserve to know my own daughter. That I didn't deserve to be there for her. Rose flinched, guilt weighing heavy on her shoulders. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like, Nick shot back, his frustration finally breaking through his usually controlled exterior. Tell me how you justified keeping her from me for 4 years. Rose exhaled slowly, feeling the sting of his words. I was scared, she admitted. I was scared that you would see her as a mistake. That you would feel trapped. That you would resent both of us. Nick's expression flickered for a second, but then his jaw tightened again. You don't know that. You're right, Rose whispered. I don't. Because I never gave you the chance. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with emotions neither of them knew how to process. Finally, Nick took a slow breath, his gaze shifting back to Lily. The little girl was still nestled in her mother's arms, playing with the hem of her sleeve, completely unaware of the turmoil surrounding her. Nick crouched down, leveling himself with her. Hey, Lily, he said, his voice softer now. Lily blinked at him with wide blue eyes. Hi. Nick hesitated for only a second before asking, do you know who I am? Lily tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. Then she glanced at Rose, as if searching for confirmation before looking back at him. You're the nice man who helped me, she said matter-of-factly. Nick let out a breath, nodding. Yeah, he said. I'm the nice man who helped you. He hesitated, his voice quieter now. But I'm also something else. Lily's brow furrowed slightly, curiosity shining in her bright blue eyes. What? Nick swallowed hard. His throat felt tight, like the words were caught somewhere deep inside him. He had spent years closing himself off, keeping emotions buried beneath layers of business and control. But looking into his daughter's eyes, the eyes that were just like his own, there was no room for anything but the truth. "I'm your dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily blinked at him, as if trying to process his words. She glanced at Rose again, then back at Nick. "Really?" Nick forced a small smile, even though his chest felt like it was about to collapse under the weight of everything. "Yeah," he said. "Really?" Lily stared at him for another long second before a small smile tugged at the corner of her lips. "Oh." Nick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Then, to his complete surprise, Lily reached out and took his hand. Nick felt his entire body go still. Her fingers were small, delicate, warm. And for the first time in his life, Nicholas Hale, the man who had built an empire from nothing, the man who had never let anyone in, felt like he had just found something more important than anything he had ever built. Nick stared down at the small hand wrapped around his own, feeling something shift deep inside him. Lily's fingers were so tiny, yet they gripped his hand with the kind of quiet confidence that made his chest tighten. He had spent years negotiating million-dollar deals, standing in boardrooms with some of the most powerful people in the world, and yet he had never felt as unprepared as he did at this moment. Lily's blue eyes, his eyes, blinked up at him with innocent curiosity, as if waiting to see what he would do next. She wasn't scared. She wasn't pulling away. She was just there. Holding his hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. Nick swallowed hard, his mind racing. He should have been furious. He should have been demanding answers, demanding to know why Rose had kept this from him for so long. But standing there, looking at Lily, the only thing he could think about was how much time he had already lost. For years. For years of first words, first steps, bedtime stories, scraped knees, and laughter, memories he would never get back. Rose's voice broke the silence. "Lily, sweetheart, why don't you go sit at the counter for a minute? I need to talk to," she hesitated, glancing at Nick before finishing, "I need to talk to Mr. Hale." Lily looked between them, sensing the tension in her mother's voice, but she didn't argue. She simply gave Nick's hand one last squeeze before letting go and skipping over to the counter, climbing onto a stool with ease. The second she was out of earshot, Nick turned to Rose, his jaw tight. "We need to talk. Now." Rose exhaled, nodding. "I know." Nick clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. "Why?" The word came out rough, edged with too many emotions he hadn't had time to process. "Why didn't you tell me?" Rose looked away for a second, her arms crossing over her chest as if bracing herself. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "Because I thought if I told you, you'd feel trapped. That you'd feel like you had to choose between your life and a child you never planned for." Nick let out a sharp breath, shaking his head. "That wasn't your choice to make, Rose. You don't get to decide how I would have felt. You don't get to erase me from my own daughter's life because you assumed I wouldn't want her." Her jaw tightened. "You weren't ready, Nick. I knew it. You knew it. You were working 18-hour days, traveling across the world, building your company. You didn't even have time for yourself, let alone for a baby." Nick took a step closer, his blue eyes burning into hers. "That doesn't mean I wouldn't have tried." Rose flinched slightly at his words, but she didn't look away. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered. Nick exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. "Well, you weren't," he said, his voice lower now. "You robbed me of 4 years. You took away my right to know her, to be there for her. And now I'm just supposed to accept that." Rose's throat tightened. "I didn't do this to hurt you, Nick." "But you did," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less intense. You hurt both of us. Silence stretched between them, heavy with everything left unsaid. Nick took another breath, forcing himself to think past the anger, past the resentment. He couldn't change the past. No matter how much he wanted to, no matter how much it ate at him, those 4 years were gone. But Lily wasn't. His voice was steadier when he spoke again. I'm not walking away from her, Rose. Rose swallowed hard, nodding. I didn't expect you to. Nick studied her, searching for any sign that she was still going to fight him on this. But all he saw was exhaustion. Guilt. And maybe something else, something like relief. He glanced over at the counter, where Lily was happily swinging her legs, playing with a small napkin like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. His daughter. He turned back to Rose. We need to figure this out. For her. Rose nodded again, her voice softer this time. Yeah. We do. For the first time that night, Nick felt like he was finally taking control of something again. But this time, it wasn't about business or power. It was about being a father. Nick had spent his entire life solving problems, negotiating impossible deals, and turning obstacles into opportunities. But as he sat across from Rose in the small booth of the restaurant, he realized this was the one situation he couldn't approach like a business transaction. There was no strategy, no quick fix, no contract that could rewrite the last 4 years and erase the time he had lost with his daughter. Rose sat across from him, her posture tense, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if bracing herself for a conversation she had spent years avoiding. Lily was still perched at the counter, happily sipping on a glass of juice, her small legs swinging beneath the stool. She was blissfully unaware of the emotional battlefield playing out just a few feet away. Nick leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice was steady, but there was no missing the edge of frustration still lingering beneath it. I need to be in her life, Rose. I don't care how we figure it out, but I'm not walking away from her. Rose exhaled slowly, looking down at the table before meeting his gaze again. I know, she admitted. And I'm not going to stop you. Nick studied her carefully. He had expected more resistance, more hesitation. But the way she said it, so certain, so resigned, told him she had already made peace with the fact that keeping him away wasn't an option anymore. He nodded, running a hand through his hair. Good. Because I'm not asking for permission. Rose's lips pressed into a tight line. I didn't think you were. A moment of silence passed between them, thick with everything they hadn't said. Nick didn't just want to be a part of Lily's life, he needed to be. But he also knew this wasn't something that could happen overnight. She didn't know him, and no matter how much he wanted to make up for lost time, he had to accept that it would take time for her to trust him. Rose must have read the thoughts on his face because she sighed, her hands loosening their grip on the table. She doesn't know anything about you, she admitted. I never told her about you. Nick clenched his jaw, but he forced himself to stay calm. Not even my name. Rose shook her head. She asked once, a long time ago, why she didn't have a dad like some of the other kids at daycare. I told her that families come in all different forms and that ours was just the two of us. After that, she stopped asking. Nick's chest tightened. She deserves to know the truth. I know, Rose said, and for the first time that night, her voice cracked slightly. But you have to understand, Nick, she's never had a father figure in her life. She doesn't know what that means. She's used to it just being the two of us. Nick exhaled, forcing himself to push down the emotions threatening to rise. Then we take it slow, he said. I don't want to overwhelm her. Rose hesitated before nodding. Okay. Nick leaned back in the booth, trying to process how quickly everything had changed. Hours ago, he had walked into this restaurant expecting nothing more than a quiet meal, and now he was sitting across from the mother of his child, trying to figure out how to be a father to a daughter he had never known existed. Rose's voice softened slightly. She likes you, you know. Nick's eyes flicked up to meet hers. She does. Rose nodded, glancing toward the counter where Lily was now drawing on a napkin with a red crayon the waitress had given her. She's not usually that comfortable with strangers. But she let you hold her hand. That's not something she does often. Nick felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at Lily again, watching the way she scrunched up her face in concentration as she carefully traced a shape on the napkin. He didn't deserve this instant acceptance from her, but he wasn't going to waste it either. I want to take her out sometime, he said finally. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Just me and her. Rose hesitated but then nodded. We can try that. Nick exhaled slowly, some of the tension in his shoulders easing for the first time since this conversation started. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was a start. And for now, that was all he could ask for. Nick arrived at the park earlier than planned, pacing near the playground as he tried to settle the unease in his chest. It had been 2 days since his conversation with Rose, 2 days since he had learned he had a daughter, and yet everything still felt surreal. He had spent those nights lying awake, replaying the moment over and over in his head, trying to come to terms with how drastically his life had changed in the span of a single evening. He wasn't afraid of responsibility. He had built an empire from the ground up, made decisions that affected thousands of lives, navigated pressure that would have broken most men. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was personal. A gust of wind rustled the autumn leaves, and Nick glanced toward the entrance of the park just as Rose appeared, walking hand in hand with Lily. His breath caught slightly as he took them in, the way Lily bounced slightly with each step, chattering excitedly to her mother about something, her tiny hands waving animatedly in the air. Rose, on the other hand, looked more reserved, her shoulders tense, as if she was still bracing for how this was all going to go. Nick swallowed hard, forcing himself to push down the nerves creeping up his spine. He wasn't going to let them get the best of him. He had waited too long for this moment, even if he hadn't known it before. Lily spotted him first. She stopped mid-sentence, blinking up at him as if assessing whether he was still the same person from the restaurant. Then, to his surprise, she grinned. "You're here," she announced, tugging at Rose's hand before breaking into a run. Nick barely had time to react before she reached him, stopping just inches away as she tilted her head up at him with a curious expression. "Did you bring me a book?" Nick let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Of all the things she could have said, he hadn't expected that. But it made him smile. "I did," he said, reaching into his coat pocket and pulling out a small, hardcover storybook. "Your mom told me you like fairy tales." Lily gasped dramatically, clutching her hands to her chest. "I love fairy tales." She took the book from his hands, turning it over in her small fingers. "Are there dragons?" Nick crouched down to her level, nodding. "Big ones. And princesses who aren't afraid of them." Lily grinned. "I like princesses who fight dragons. They're cooler than the ones who just wait for a prince." Nick chuckled, glancing up at Rose, who was watching them with a guarded expression. He could tell she was still trying to process how easily Lily had taken to him. He didn't blame her. He was just as surprised. "Do you want me to read it to you?" he asked, shifting his attention back to Lily. Lily thought about it for a moment, then nodded enthusiastically. "But only if we sit on the swings. It's the best place for stories." Nick hesitated, glancing at Rose for approval. She gave a small nod, her lips pressing together as if she was still deciding how she felt about all of this. "Swings it is," Nick said, straightening up. Lily grabbed his hand without hesitation, pulling him toward the playground. Nick let himself be led, still in awe of how naturally she accepted him. He had expected distance, hesitation, maybe even resistance. But instead, she acted as if he had always been there, as if he was already a part of her world. As they reached the swings, Lily climbed onto one and motioned for him to sit on the one beside her. Nick obliged, holding the book in his lap as he opened it. Lily leaned in close, her legs kicking slightly as she waited for him to start. He began reading, his voice steady, but he was only half focused on the words. His mind kept drifting to the little girl beside him, to the way she listened with such rapt attention, to the way she already trusted him without question. It was humbling in a way nothing else had ever been. Halfway through the story, Lily suddenly reached for his sleeve, tugging it gently. "You have a nice voice," she said matter-of-factly. "Like a prince." Nick blinked, caught off guard. He wasn't sure why, but her words settled something deep inside him. Rose, who had been standing a few feet away, let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "That's a first," she murmured. Nick smirked, shaking his head before turning back to Lily. "You think so?" Lily nodded solemnly. "Yep. A prince or maybe a knight." Nick leaned in slightly, lowering his voice to a playful whisper. "Knights fight dragons, you know." Lily's eyes widened. "That means you could be one." Nick chuckled, flipping the page. "Guess we'll have to find out." Rose was still watching them, her arms crossed, but there was something softer in her expression now, something that told Nick she was seeing something she hadn't expected to see. They stayed at the park for hours, playing, talking, reading more stories. When it was finally time to leave, Lily hugged Nick without hesitation, wrapping her small arms around his waist. He froze for half a second before gently returning the hug, something in his chest tightening at the unexpected gesture. As Rose led her toward the car, Lily looked over her shoulder, waving. "Bye, night Nick." Nick huffed out a laugh, shaking his head as he waved back. Rose lingered for a moment before finally meeting his gaze. "That went better than I expected." Nick nodded. "Yeah. It did. There was still so much to figure out. So many conversations left to have. But for the first time since all of this had started, Nick felt something close to peace. And for now, that was enough. Nick couldn't stop thinking about the way Lily had hugged him before leaving the park. It was such a small gesture, something most parents probably took for granted, but to him, it had meant everything. He hadn't expected it. He had barely known what to do when her little arms wrapped around him, trusting and warm. And yet, in that moment, something inside him had settled, something that had been restless since the night he learned the truth. Now, 2 days later, he stood outside Rose's apartment, shifting his weight as he waited for her to open the door. He had been invited this time, but that didn't make it any easier. He was still an outsider in their world, trying to figure out where he fit in. The door opened, and Rose stood there, her brown eyes scanning his face with the same guarded expression she always wore around him. But there was something different now, something less defensive. She stepped aside without a word, letting him in. The apartment was small but cozy. The living room was filled with bookshelves, a few framed pictures on the walls, and a couch that had clearly been through years of use. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it felt like home. And for the first time, Nick realized just how little he actually knew about the life Rose had built for herself and their daughter. "Lily's in her room," Rose said, closing the door behind him. "She's been talking about you non-stop since the park." Nick felt something warm spread through his chest at that. He turned to face Rose fully. "That's a good sign, right?" She nodded slowly, crossing her arms. "Yeah. It is." Before he could say anything else, small, hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A second later, Lily appeared, wearing a bright yellow princess dress, a plastic tiara slightly crooked on her head. She stopped when she saw him, her eyes lighting up. "You came." Nick smiled, crouching slightly. "I told you I would." Lily beamed, then lifted the fabric of her dress as she twirled. "I'm a princess today," she announced. "But not the kind that waits for a prince. The kind that fights dragons. Nick let out a quiet chuckle. That's the best kind of princess. Lily nodded seriously. Mommy says you're staying for dinner. Nick glanced at Rose, who was now leaning against the kitchen counter, watching their interaction with a quiet expression. If that's okay with you. Rose shrugged. She insisted. Lily grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the couch. Do you like spaghetti? Mommy makes the best spaghetti. Nick let himself be led, sitting down as she climbed onto the couch beside him, her dress puffing up around her. I love spaghetti, he said. Do I get to help? Lily gasped. You want to help? He smirked, glancing at Rose. I think I can manage stirring a pot. Lily giggled, then leaned in as if she were about to tell him a very important secret. Mommy doesn't like when people mess up her kitchen. Rose rolled her eyes from across the room. Lily, don't scare him off before he even tries. Nick laughed, feeling something unfamiliar settle in his chest. This moment, sitting in their home, listening to Lily talk, watching Rose pretend she wasn't amused, felt real. It felt like something he had never allowed himself to want, something he had convinced himself he didn't need. But now that he was here, he realized just how wrong he had been. Dinner was easy. Surprisingly so. Lily talked the entire time, filling every silence with stories about school, her favorite books, and the way her stuffed animals had different voices when she played with them. Nick listened, genuinely fascinated by the way her mind worked. Every now and then, Rose would interject, rolling her eyes at Lily's dramatics or reminding her to actually eat her food instead of just talking about it. And then there was the moment he hadn't expected. After dinner, Lily pulled out a stack of crayons and a few sheets of paper, setting up on the coffee table. She was drawing something with intense concentration, her tongue poking out slightly as she worked. Nick leaned over, watching her. What are you making? Lily looked up at him, then down at the paper before holding it up for him to see. It was a picture, 3 stick figures, one clearly smaller than the others, all holding hands. There was a house in the background, a sun in the corner, and a big blue scribble above them that he assumed was the sky. She pointed at each figure as she spoke. This is me. This is Mommy. And this, she tapped the tallest figure. This is you. Nick stared at the drawing, something tight forming in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say, wasn't sure how to process the fact that, in her mind, he was already part of her life. Rose, who had been clearing the table, glanced over. Her eyes softened when she saw the drawing, but she didn't say anything. She just let the moment sit between them, giving him space to take it in. Nick cleared his throat, forcing himself to speak past the lump there. That's a pretty amazing drawing. Lily beamed. Do you like it? Nick nodded. I love it. Lily seemed satisfied with that answer, immediately going back to coloring in the sky. Nick sat back, exhaling slowly as he ran a hand through his hair. He had spent his entire life chasing success, thinking that was the only thing that mattered. But sitting here, watching his daughter draw their family on a piece of paper, he realized he had been wrong. He didn't just want to be a part of her life. He needed to be. Nick wasn't sure how long he sat there, staring at the drawing Lily had made. It was just a simple picture, scribbled with bright colors and uneven lines, but to him, it meant more than anything else he had achieved in his life. His name had been on Forbes covers, on corporate buildings, on contracts worth millions, yet here it was, drawn in crayon beside 2 stick figures labeled Mommy and Lily, as if he had always belonged there. Lily, oblivious to the weight of what she had done, continued coloring, humming softly to herself. Rose moved around the apartment, gathering plates and wiping down the counters, but every now and then, he caught her watching him. She wasn't looking at him with anger anymore, or even with hesitation. It was something softer, something that almost made him wonder if she had been waiting for this moment just as much as he had. Lily, Rose finally said, breaking the silence. It's almost bedtime. Lily let out a dramatic sigh, setting down her crayon as if the weight of responsibility was too much for her to bear. Do I have to? Rose arched a brow. Do you want to be a grumpy dragon tomorrow? Lily considered this for a moment before sighing again, clearly defeated. Fine. Nick watched as she stood up, stretching her arms before turning to him with wide, expectant eyes. Are you gonna be here tomorrow? Nick hesitated, glancing at Rose. He wasn't sure what the right answer was, wasn't sure if he was overstepping, but before he could even speak, Rose gave a small nod, barely noticeable but enough to tell him she wasn't going to push him away. He looked back at Lily and smiled. Yeah. I'll be here. Lily grinned, satisfied with his answer. She walked over, hesitated for just a second, then wrapped her small arms around his middle, hugging him tight. Nick barely had time to react before she pulled away, running off down the hall to her room. He sat there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It had only been days since he found out about her, and yet somehow, she had already decided he belonged. Rose leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching him carefully. She's already attached to you, she said quietly. You can't disappear. Nick met her gaze, something solid and unwavering in his own. I'm not going anywhere. Rose studied him for a long moment before nodding. She pushed off the counter, heading toward the hallway, but before she disappeared, she paused. Good night, Nick. It was the first time she had said his name without tension, without hesitation, without a wall between them. He exhaled, leaning back against the couch. Good night, Rose. As he sat there, listening to the faint sound of Lily giggling from her room as Rose read her a bedtime story, Nick realized that for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was running after something he could never catch. He wasn't chasing another deal, another success, another number on a balance sheet. For the first time, he was exactly where he needed to be. And he wasn't going to let it go.